Hello and welcome back to the Xamarin Forms tutorial where we work on a time tracker app. Today we're going to work on some custom entries that have a little bit of animation in them, and it's going to get us closer to our design for the login page. We're going to add some animated underlines to these entries, so when you click them we'll see a gradient fill up, and so we have this sort of half opaque underline, and when you click it it will animate out and become a brighter white, and when you click away from it and make it lose focus, it'll animate back down to its half opacity. As always, I'm Patrick, and this is the Let's Create series. And so now we can head back over to the login page, and we need to add two entries, which we need to create our own entries so that we can update the way they look. So we need two entries. We need the forgot password button, a login button, and a use phone number button. We already have this icon view in the stack layout, so we can keep that and change its source from binding icon just to history, whatever the name is of the file that you brought in. So the name of my file is history, and so now we can see we have the history icon up here at the top, and so that's good. We do want it to have a decent sized margin above, so let's go ahead and do that now. And so I'm going to change this margin from 20 all around to 20 left right is fine. We'll do something like 80 on the top, and then we can keep 20/20 for the right and the bottom. And so that'll move that down just a little ways, and so that's pretty good. The next thing we need to do is create this entry, which will have that placeholder and the line at the bottom. So we can go ahead and stop our app, and we'll go to Views, and we'll make a new folder in Views, and we'll name this folder Entries. And with our entries folder there, we can right click that entries folder we just created and click add new class. And our new class is going to be a borderless entry, or like an underline free entry, because Android will have an underline and iOS will have a border. So we're just going to call this plain entry. This plain entry is going to extend from a Xamarin Forms entry. And so we can use a quick fix to bring in Xamarin Forms. And that's all we're going to do for that for now, so we can close that. And we created this entry so that we can make renderers on each platform to get rid of those extra features like the underline on Android and the border on iOS. So that's good. The next thing we need is a view for our login entry view. So we'll right-click Views, click Add, and New File this time. We'll go to Forms, and we'll do a Content View XAML. And we'll call this one Login Entry View. Navigating over to the Login Entry View XAML, we can fill in some content. And so this is going to need a grid. And in this grid, we need an entry and then some bottom border. If we look at the design, we'll see we have like the entry and then our own bottom border. The reason we're doing our own bottom border is because we want to kind of animate it so it looks really nice. And so in here we can add that plain entry we just created, and so we can do that by going up to the attributes of the content view, and we can say XML NS, and we'll just use entries equals entries, and it should kind of recommend that views.entries for us. And so in here we can use that plain entry, and for now we'll just close that out. We're going to end up setting a binding context on that, but for now we'll close that out. And then beneath that we need a box view, and so this box view needs a name because we're going to do some stuff on the code behind, but for now we'll just say BV underline is fine. We need to set a color on this box view, so that color will be white, and an opacity. So its initial opacity is going to be just something like 0.5. So when it's not focused, it'll kind of be a faded white, and then when you focus it, it'll animate to a more opaque white. This box view needs a height request, and so we'll just say 2. And it needs a row, so grid.row will be 1. So it'll be the second index, 0, 1. And so now we need to tell this grid it needs a couple row definitions. So the first one is going to be the size of the entry, and so something like 40 or 30 is fine here for now. And the second one is going to be 2. And so that is just for the box view, and then some kind of little magic trick we're going to do with a gradient view, a horizontal gradient view. So the next thing we need to do is create that gradient view. So we'll head over to SK Views, and we're going to add something here, and so we'll add a new class, and we're going to call this one an underline gradient view. So underline gradient view. This underline gradient view can still inherit from base.gradient view base, but now we need to make a small change. Before we make that change, let's go ahead and use a quick fix to implement the abstract class, which wants us to draw the actual gradient. But now let's head over to that gradient view base, and instead of creating the shader in the parent, let's allow the children to override that. So let's make a protected virtual method. So protected virtual, and then this will return an SK shader. And then we'll call this create gradient shader. The default can just return what we've been doing. So we can just cut it from the on-paint surface and just return and then paste it there. And we'll notice it needs info. So let's go ahead and add that as a parameter. So we'll say SK image info and info. And so back in on-paint surface, we can just say create gradient shader and we'll pass in info. And now any child can override this and change the way the gradient is. But if they don't, then it'll still be the way it was before. So that's actually super perfect. So we can just save that. And then we'll head back over to this underline gradient view. And now we can override the create gradient shader. And so instead of returning the base, now we can do our own thing to this. So what we'll want to do here is return an SK shader.create linear gradient again, but instead of that default, now we're going to change it just a little bit. And so the first thing we'll do is make a new SK point. And so this one will come from X is 0 and Y is just half of the height. So info.height divided by 2. So that's the start point. The end point here is going to be the middle X, but still the middle Y as well. So new SK point, and this will be info.width divided by 2, and the same info.height divided by 2. The next thing we'll do is provide the colors, and so this will just be start and end color. So we'll say new, and then this takes in that same SK color array, and it'll be start color dot to SK color, and this is going to need a quick fix to import the using for skiasharp.views.forms. And then we'll go to end color. So end color dot to SK color again. And so that'll take care of the colors. The next thing we need to do is define where the colors start and end. And so instead of it being 0 to 1, which is one of the things that we do in the parent, we're going to change this to a new float array. And this will go from 0 to 0.5. And so this will go half the distance. And the next thing we need to do is change the way the SK shader tile mode is. So instead of repeat, we'll want to change it to SK shader tile mode dot mirror. Last thing we want to do here is obviously change 0.5 to 0.5f because it's a float. And we'll just add a semicolon at the end, and that will return the SK shader we need. So when the parent calls this create gradient shader and passes in info, it's going to get our overridden method instead of the default return. So that's good there. And now we need to actually draw this shape. So we're going to end up drawing a rectangle, very similar to the way the rect gradient view draws. So instead of inheriting from this base, we can just inherit right from rect gradient view, and the draw gradient is already handled then. So we'll just, instead of inheriting from base.gradient view base, we'll inherit from rect gradient view. And we can just go ahead and delete this call to the draw gradient. We also don't really need this constructor, so we can delete that as well. And all we're doing really here is changing the way the shader is created. So we can save this, and we'll head back to the login entry view. And here we can bring in the namespace for the SK views, so XML-NS, and we'll just call it SK views again. And we can just say SK views, and it should kind of recommend our views.sk views. Below the box views is going to be our SK views.gradient underline. So it'll be SK views, and it'll be an underline gradient view. So we need to declare a start color and an end color. The start color is going to be transparent, and the end color is going to be white. This underline gradient needs to also be in grid.row equals 1. So we'll say grid.row equals 1. And now we can go up to the attributes of this plain entry, and we can enter in a placeholder of just something like email, which we're going to bind to a view model here in a little bit, but we'll just put email, and then the placeholder color is going to be basically white. So FFF, but in front of that, let's put an A. So if we look at the designs, we'll see that email isn't as bright white as the border underneath of it, so that's good. So now with that all there, let's go to Login Page and let's bring in this login entry view. And so that is in views, which we already have the namespace declared. So just right under our history image, let's just bring in that view. So this is a login entry view. We can close it right out. We don't need to mess with any attributes, and we can press run to see how it looks in our app. With our app running, we can see that we have the entry up top, which still has that underline, but we also have that gradient border at the bottom. With that box view there, we can't really see the gradient, so let's go ahead and just set that box view opacity to 0 for now, just so we can see the gradient just a little better. So we'll set it to 0, save, and hot reload should show us that we have a gradient across. So we see that it's kind of a bright white in the middle, and it is faded out on the side. So that's good. I'm going to Control Z here, or Command Z, so we can get our 0.5 back. And then we'll work on getting rid of that underline on iOS and Android. So let's save everything we've done so far. We can go ahead and stop the app, and let's make our custom renderers. So in Android, we can head over to the renderers folder. We can add a new class, and this will be a plain entry renderer. Our plain entry renderer can extend the Xamarin Forms entry renderer. We can use a quick fix to import the using here. And then our constructor, it really likes to have context passed in. So let's go ahead and pass in the context here, and we'll use a quick fix, and we'll import the using for android.content. And then we'll just send that to the base constructor. So we'll just send context as the variable name that we named it, and we'll send that to base. Next, we can override the onElementChanged method, and right after base, which is going to set the native control, we can just make sure control is not null. So if control does not equal null, then we can just set the background to null. So we can either say background equals null or set background to null. Either one is fine. The last thing we need to do is right above the namespace declaration, we can make an assembly attribute for export renderer. And this will take a type of our plain entry, which is going to have an error because we don't have the using. And then it's also going to be a type of our plain entry renderer. Once you have those typed in, we can use a quick fix to bring in the using for the renderer's namespace, which would handle the plain entry renderer. And then another quick fix to bring in the using for views.entries, and that'll take care of plain entry. So we can save here, and now if we rerun, we should see that the underline is gone. With our app running, we can confirm that the underline is gone, but we do see that we have a pretty large space or gap between email and the box view. So let's go ahead and set this controls padding to 0 while we're here. So we'll just say 0, 0, 0, 0 on set padding. So that should help with that, and we can handle the rest of it in Xamarin Forms as needed. So we should be good here on the plain entry renderer for Android. So now we can make our plain entry renderer for iOS. So let's go ahead and stop the app. Then we'll go to the iOS project. We'll head over to renderers, and we will add a new class here. And this will be plain entry renderer again. Very, very similar to the Android implementation. We will just extend the Xamarin Forms entry renderer. So we'll type entry renderer, and we'll use a quick fix to bring in Xamarin Forms Platform iOS. And now we don't need to pass anything to the constructor. We could actually get rid of that, but we do still need to override onElementChanged. And under base.onElementChange, which is where the control gets set, we can again check to make sure control is not null. And if it's not null, we can change its border style to UIKit.UITextBorderStyle.none. And that'll get rid of the border there for iOS. And then again, above the namespace declaration, we can use an assembly attribute for export renderer. And this will take in the same text. It'll be a type of plain entry, and then it'll be type of plain entry renderer. And then we'll use those same two quick fixes. So the first one for the renderer's namespace in iOS, and the second one for the views.entry namespace for the plain entry. So that takes care of the appearance of the plain entry, but now we can start adding some more attributes to this. So We are going to want to set the font family on the plain entry, and this is going to be that Nunito regular. And if we look at our fonts, it should be just the name, so Nunito regular. The next thing we want to do is name it. So we'll say X name equals something like ENT input is fine. We already have our box view named. It is BV underline. And so we also need to name this underline gradient view. And so we can just give this a name. And then we can just say something like GRD underline. The last thing we're going to want to do here is change underline gradient view scale X to 0. And so this is going to make it invisible, which is good because when the entry is not focused, we don't want the gradient and we want the regular box view to be just half opacity. And so we can head over to the code behind. So if you don't see it, you can use the expand arrow and we'll see same name.xaml but with a .cs behind it. And now we can kind of subscribe to the focused and unfocused events of the entry. So we can say ent input.focused plus equals and subscribe to it. We can also subscribe to unfocused and it can just go to the same method. And then in here we can check to see if the event args is focused or not. So if it is focused, we want to animate things one way, and then if it's actually losing focus, we want to animate a different way. So on e.isFocused, so we can say task.whenAll, and then we'll use a quick fix to import the using for tasks. And then we'll do bv underline dot fade to, and this will go all the way to full opacity. And let's say it takes the normal time, just the 250 milliseconds. So we don't even actually have to add that. But at the same time, so let's also run, this is why we're doing a task.whenAll, let's also change the scale on that gradient underline. So we'll say grd underline dot scale x2. And so this scale is going to be a full 1, and it could be in the same amount of time, so both of those are fine. And then while we're here, we can make this an asynchronous method, and we can await this. So that'll take care of both of those. When the focus is actually lost or when the entry becomes unfocused, now we want to go the other direction. So we'll say task.whenAll again. And so BV underline is going to go back to 0.5. So fade to 0.5. And GRD underline dot scale x2 is going to go back down to 0. And so now we can run the app again and we can check to make sure that that animation is working properly. With our app running, we see that we have email. There's still a space there. And then we have this box view that is sort of not fully opaque, and when we click, we'll see that an animation runs and it turns kind of a brighter white, and then when we click off, we'll see that that animates back down, and so we can click back and forth just to make sure our animation is looking pretty good. And I would say it does. It looks pretty good. The animation is running. Everything looks pretty good to me. So the next thing we'll want to do here is kind of bind this. Let's remove email from placeholder back in the login entry view. We'll remove email from placeholder and we'll replace it with binding placeholder, which we don't have yet, but we will. The next thing we want is to bind the text so that we can retrieve it later. So we'll just say text equals binding text. I would say everything else here looks pretty good. So now we'll go to view models. We can right click view models, add and new class, and this is going to be a login entry view model. Login entry view model. Okay, with login entry view model, we can extend from extended bindable object. And with that done, we can make our two properties, our bindable properties here, or binded properties. So we can say private string placeholder, and the public variant of that is public string placeholder with a capital P. And then the get will just return that private member, but set will use set property, and it'll use a reference to placeholder, and it'll pass in value. We'll do the same thing for text. Once that's done, we can get rid of the constructor because we don't really need it. We'll also want to be able to have a way to tell if this entry is a password or not, so we'll make a Boolean for that. So we'll say private bool is password. And then we'll do the public variant of that. Once you have that done, you can save and close the view model. And then back in this login entry view, we also want to handle that here on the entry. So another attribute in the plain entry is password, and we'll just use binding is password. Once you've done that, you can save, and then we'll head back to our login page model. And we don't really need these login option view models anymore, so we can delete both of those. We'll get some errors because we kind of initialized those in the constructor, so we can just delete both of those as well. The go-to email login is not really necessary anymore because we're going to kind of have that as the default login mechanism, so we can just delete that method as well. And then the go-to phone login we will use on this use phone number button. So now that we have this, we can make another property up here. And so this will just be a public login entry view model. And we can just call this one email entry view model. And it can be get set. We're also going to need another one for password. So we can say public login entry view model again. And this one will be password entry view model. And then in the constructor, we can initialize both of those. So email entry view model will equal new login entry view model. And then this will take in a couple properties. So the placeholder will be email. And then is placeholder and text are both just default, so we don't need the comma here. And then the password entry view model is a new login entry view model. And this one will take two of the three properties. It'll be placeholder equals password. And then is password is true. So instead of taking up, 6 or 8 or 9 lines here, we can go back to that view model that I just told you to close. So let's go ahead and reopen it. And we can re-add the constructor. So public login entry view model. And then in here, we can take in some quick values. So the first one will be a string placeholder. And the second one will be a Boolean is password. So we're not really going to worry about setting text automatically. If you want to do that, you can do that later. But for now, we'll just say placeholder equals placeholder and is password equals is password. Just make sure it's the lowercase version so that it uses the passed in parameter and not uses itself. So with that, we're going to have some errors here because now it wants us to use the constructor we just created. So instead of all of these lines, we can just say email and false. And then we can get rid of those 3 lines below. And then we can do the same thing up here. This one will be password and true. And then we can get rid of those bottom 4 lines as well. So that takes care of that. The last thing we need to do here is bind those on the login page. So we have these login option views. We don't really want those anymore. But we do want to set the binding context on this login entry view. So we'll just say binding context equals binding. And this will just be the email entry view model. And then we want another one set. So we'll copy this and paste, and we'll change email entry view model to password entry view model. And now when we press run, so we got to stop the app if it's running. Now when we press run, we should see 2 entries, and they should be a little bit different. One should say email, one should say password. When we type into the password one, it should give us the dots like normal. And so let's run the app and see how it goes. With the app running, we can see that we have email and password. Email, when we type into it, we'll see that it's regular text. We do see that we have a problem here. It's a dark text. We want it to be white. But we'll see that password is kind of hiding behind the dots. So that's good. Let's real quick head back over to login entry view. And let's change text color to white on both of these. So the plain entry text color white, when we just set it there one time and save, this should refresh the view. And now we can see that the text and the password text are both white. I think that's a good stopping point for today's video. If you like the video, feel free to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments section. Thank you for watching the Xamarin Forms tutorial. I'm Patrick, and this is the Let's Create series.